You're listening to the American Skald, a musicology podcast. Hello and welcome to the American Skald, a Nordic musicology podcast. My name is Jameson Foster, and I will be your guide through the fascinating history of Nordic classical music and other musics as well. A quick introduction about myself. I am a PhD student in musicology at CU Boulder, where I specialize in Nordic music with a master's in musicology from Peabody Conservatory. As a musicology PhD student, I also teach recitations for the Vikings and Norse mythology classes over in the Nordic Studies department, under Dr. Matthias Nordvig, who some of you may know from the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I highly recommend that podcast, by the way, for all things Viking Age if you aren't familiar with it already. So as a musicologist, I work primarily with Norwegian music from the Bronze Age to black metal, and everything in between. My secondary interest is in American roots music, bluegrass, jazz, blues, all that good stuff, because as a musician I play the big dumb upright bass, and those are the genres that I love to play. I'm also a huge unapologetic metalhead and metal musician, and you can find what little black metal I've finished under the name Aevir, A-E-V-I-R, if you're into that sort of stuff at all. So enough about me, because you're here for the good stuff, to learn a little bit about Nordic music history. For those of you who are new around these parts and haven't been following me since the first two incarnations of this podcast, here's how we're going to do this. I'll be going through each of the Nordic countries one at a time. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and then we'll see where we go from there. And we will cover their key composers in roughly chronological order, as well as tackling any other relevant topics. For more info on Nordic folk music rather than classical though, you can head on over to my website, theamericanskald.com, where you will find a page called the Nordicsound Review. For those of you who have been with me since the beginning of this podcast, you'll probably recognize that is the old name of this podcast. But now this podcast is simply called the American Skald because it didn't really need two titles. This review series is now called the Nordicsound Review, and it's about folk music because folk music plays a massive, massive role in the cultural history and heritage of the Nordic countries. But talking about it strictly through the lens of classical music in this podcast is pretty limiting and doesn't do the living and working folk musicians keeping these traditions alive any justice. So the Nordicsound Review is going to be a project of mine where I will talk about and review qualitatively, not quantitatively. I'm not interested in 5 out of 10 stars or whatever, the recent and current folk music groups who are keeping up the traditions of the Nordic countries. The goal of the Nordicsound Review is to give Nordic folk music a solid foothold for Americans or other English speakers who are interested in it, because as it stands, there just aren't many ways for English speakers to really get to know Nordic folk music today, aside from the occasional tiny desk. So, through the Nordicsound Review, it is my hope that I will be able to create a place on this wonderful thing we call the internet for people to learn about and explore the incredible folk music of the Nordic countries. If you're interested, definitely go check it out. I currently have 3 reviews up and expect to add to them. One for Dreamer's Circus, one for Vadruna, and another for Vaesen, with many more on the way. If you love Nordic folk music or want to dip your toes in, then head on over to theamericanskald.com to learn more about it. On this podcast, though, it's a bit of a different story. What makes Nordic classical music so individual, unique, and charming is because of just how much of a role the folk music of those countries played in the development of their respective classical music traditions. To that extent, I will definitely be talking about the folk music of these countries, but only in a big picture sense as they pertain to the composers that interacted with them. So on this podcast, definitely expect to learn some stuff about the folk music, but it won't be as detailed as actually getting your hands dirty and listening to the folk music itself. I mean, Grieg's Norwegian dances are great, but even he knew they couldn't replace the real experience of listening to a hardanger fiddle. Lastly, I want to mention that this podcast is meant to be accessible for casual listening, and not meant to be as comprehensive as possible. Though I am a PhD student, this podcast is not meant to read at that level, because even I would lose interest after long enough. In short, this means I will end up having to make general statements that are far more complicated and nuanced than I make them seem. So if you are a fellow musicologist who hears something I say and you think, well, that's oversimplifying it a bit, then you are probably right, because that's my point. I want this podcast to be accessible and digestible. With that said, if anyone listening finds themselves wanting to learn more about something I talk about, then feel free to email me, and I'd be delighted to point you in the right direction for learning more. I like to think that I'm somewhat approachable. So the reason I'm aiming for simplicity and accessibility above all else is because there are countless resources for other music scholars to find what I'm talking about here. But people who aren't in academia may find it difficult to find this stuff on their own, because we all know it's hard to sift through Google searches trying to differentiate between good and bad information. Hopefully I find a happy medium between accessibility and nuance, but I'm not perfect, just passionate. One important ground rule before getting started. I will never assume that you, the listener, have any prior theory or music history knowledge. I am a firm believer that the easiest way to turn someone off from learning about classical music is if I were to start throwing around a bunch of big fancy theory terms or big fancy musicology terms. I mean, musicology itself is already a fancy word. All I want is for you, the listener, to hopefully come to appreciate the music that I am so deeply passionate about. In the inevitable case that I do have to bring up a term we may not all know, I will of course take the time to explain it as best I can. Oh, and before I forget, the question of actually listening to music here. For those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while now, there used to be music samples. I would talk about a piece and then play it. Well, because of copyright purposes and not wanting to have to redo a whole episode if I get a copyright strike, I'm just going to omit it altogether. I tried it for the last few episodes of the last incarnation of the Swedish series, and it honestly didn't affect plays at all. So, for the sake of ease, I'm going to leave the music samples out, but link really important pieces by composers in the show notes. Hopefully that's a happy medium. Okay, so now, as we get into Norway, I'm going to get my biases out on the table. The reason I'm starting with Norway is because of my work as a musicologist. I find it to be the most fascinating of the Nordic countries from a musical standpoint, and their history is fascinating to me as well. Speaking of history, there is going to be a lot of social and cultural history in this podcast, as one of the tenets of musicology is the understanding that music does not exist in a vacuum. Music informs culture, culture informs music. This is a point I will labor throughout the entire podcast. You cannot truly understand the music of any culture on Earth without understanding that culture's history, at least from my point of view. As this is a question I see pop up all the time on Reddit, for instance. Quote, why does this music from X culture sound so different from the music from Y culture? And so often the attempted answers stumble over the same mistake of not considering the story outside of the music, the history of the people that make it. So in order to make an honest attempt at learning the music of Norway, we first need to learn about its history, because again, music does not exist in a vacuum. Rather, music depends on socio-political change and growth for its own change and growth, as we will learn every step of the way through the music histories of Norway, Sweden, and beyond. So let's get started. Norway is a country steeped deeply in its ancestral history of sagas, kings, and the Viking Age. Unlike most other European countries, the history of Norway is not so much one of fighting people for their survival, but the very land itself. Indeed, besides Finland and Iceland, Norway has one of the most inhospitable environments in all of Europe, and ever since the first humans appeared there around 10,000 years ago last time I checked, it's been an endless conflict between humans and landscape. To put it into perspective, most of the Norwegian population today living in the cities with all the comforts and amenities it brings are found at the same latitude of Alaska. Now let's take modern comforts out of the picture. The Norwegians were surviving at the same latitude as Alaska, though of course it is a little more hospitable than Alaska thanks to the Gulf Stream. Still, that only helps so much. For the soil itself doesn't lend well to farming, so for all of Norwegian history, even to today, agriculture never replaced the ancient methods of hunting, fishing, or foraging, but rather supplemented it. Even today, rural Norwegian communities are quite dependent on the natural resources for food, and there's a reason so much of the cuisine is based on hunting, fishing, and foraging for those very natural resources. Some of the oldest archaeological finds of humans in Norway even shows most of the diet came from the sea. Whale, seal, fish, and even ocean birds and their eggs made up most of the diet, as it was far too dangerous to travel inland, so most of the food was found on the coast. It wasn't until the Romans introduced a little thing called the axe to the Norwegian people that humans began adventuring further into the interior, for the axe doubled as a tool and as a weapon. Sturdy enough to fight both a tree and a bear to some success. So how did people do it? How did they not just survive but turn Norway into what it is today despite these insane challenges? Well, they mostly did it not only through sheer force of will, but through community. Norwegian history is a great example of how humans can overcome any challenge so long as they band together. Families would join and build communities together that would have a shared farm, and a shared fishing hut by the coast, and a shared hunting camp up in the mountains. But even then, there was only so much you could do to survive and thrive off of the natural resources alone. Enter stage left, the Viking era. I simply can't talk about Norway without mentioning the Vikings, because it was the Vikings that played such a transformative role in Europe at large. Now, the Vikings came from Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, but I would safely say, at the expense of making myself an easy target and pissing off Matthias Nordvig, that the Norwegians were probably the most influential. There's that bias again. The Norwegians, along with the Danes of course, are the ones who would raid France, Saxony, England, and Ireland, and even settle the Scottish islands of Orkney, Man, and Skye before eventually settling in eastern England itself. These Vikings shot out from Scandinavian coasts out of one motivation: necessity. As the Norse began interacting with the lands around them, they quickly found that they were at an inherent disadvantage, especially the Norwegians. Their farmland wasn't great, they were relying on Denmark for iron for centuries, and they came up with a great idea. Why trade when you can take? And that they did. Norway and Denmark would go west, while Sweden would primarily go east, all the way to Baghdad and bring home riches, foods, and valuable goods back home to their families. But let's not oversimplify things. The Norwegian Vikings did far more than just raid and pillage. They were of course trading, exploring, and settling as well, but that's the business of history books, and I'm in the business of a music history podcast. So all you need to know about the Norwegian Viking Age is that it was what brought Norway out of the Iron Age and put it on the same playing field roughly as the rest of Europe. At its height, the Norwegians had settlements from Scotland to Iceland to Greenland all the way to North America, with a significant economic influence with England and Central Europe as well. However, it's important to note that to go Viking was more of like a summer job, alright? Only a maximum of about 10% of the Norwegian population actually went on Viking raids at any given time, and even then they would only do it in the summer. So before you go thinking that all of Norway was going on Viking raids, no, it's just a single job description. So for a brief moment in time after the Viking Age ended in the 11th century until around the 14th century, Norway was something bordering on a European superpower. Its art, culture, and literature were highly respected, and even today, Norse mythology pervades a shocking amount of our own culture today, ranging from Thor topping box offices to us still scheduling meetings to have on Odin's Day. So, moving right along, after the Viking Age between 11th and the 14th centuries, Norway was something of a borderline international superpower, with an expansive empire and strong economy. But this power toppled hard after a series of civil wars and weak kings that let Norway become reliant on the Hanseatic League. Ultimately, Norway ended up as a kingdom of Denmark from the 15th to the 19th century. The biggest nail in the coffin of the Norwegian power was, of course, the Black Death in the late 14th century. Norway was not only one of the hardest hit of all the European nations, but it was one of the slowest to recover. In actuality, the Black Death was the great equalizer of Norwegian society. Kings, queens, nobles, knights, bishops, lawyers, they were all reduced to the wealth and status of no more than a farmer. Think about what that does to a national conscience, when even the most powerful and arrogant of people are reduced to being equals with those who work the land. And because of Norway's status as a secondary nation to Denmark, this unique breed of social equality, roughly speaking, would last well into the 19th century. All other nations recovered from the Black Death in at least a century or two, but not Norway. Norway remains poor, and it remains secondary. So except for that brief moment of being a superpower, Norway hasn't had it very easy. It often found itself as a pawn or a subject of wealthier powers. This is the important thread to follow as we learn about the unique and beautiful history of classical music in Norway, and how it ultimately helped the nation gain the confidence it needed to claim its independence in 1905. Norwegian history is far more complex and nuanced than as I'm presenting it here, and even then it might seem convoluted, which it can be, but there's only so much I can cover in a podcast that's supposed to be about music history. But I think what we covered here sets a good enough primer on Norway's history up until around the 18th century, for this is pretty much what we need to know to form a basic understanding of Norwegian music, politics, and culture moving forward through the 19th century into the present day. So friends, thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the American Skald Musicology Podcast. If you like the show, please be sure to leave a review and subscribe, and visit my website, theamericanskald.com, to get to know more about what I do or leave a donation. Also, you can follow me on Instagram, but more importantly, you can join the hundreds of others like yourself who have an interest in Nordic music culture over at the subreddit r/Nordicsound. We'd love to have you join us. So don't be a stranger, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the American Skald, a musicology podcast.